And we're asking another question, and that is, what is the impact of Latinos? Is there an impact? Let's presume. We know there must be something happening, but what is the impact of Latinos in the U.S. economy? What's the tie to the growth of the U.S. economy? And off they went and did this, as I said, groundbreaking study. I hope all of you have gotten it. We have a summary as well for you. And that's what we want to talk about today. So I'll start by asking Jacob just to give us a synopsis of what the main themes were in the findings in your study.
Sure. Well, thank you, Ted. And let me start by thanking you and the LDC for inviting me to come here. It's a great pleasure to be here. And it was a great pleasure to work with both EY and Sol on this study because it actually came about, as you said, Ted, from a question and a very sort of basic run-of-the-mill economics model. Where does growth come from? And as we were then fortunately guided by both Sol and EY to take perhaps a slightly more holistic approach to that. So the study basically has three main components. It has a component about labor force productivity. It has a component about entrepreneurship. And it has a component about, excuse me, educational attainment of the Latino cohort. And I must say I was really very pleasant, not surprised, but still it was great for me to sit through Jeffrey's presentation in the morning because it's basically a study that uses many of the same data as we did and reaches largely the same conclusions. And just in a broader context, I think it's important to Sol's earlier point about data. When you have different people looking at the same data at the same time and reaching the same conclusions, that's how you get to facts. That's how you get to truth, if you like. And that's obviously something that is in short supply, certainly in Washington these days. So I think that's an important element. But to start with the first component, and this will overlap with some of what Jeffrey already talked about, is that when you look at the U.S. growth going forward, most projections will say that the U.S. economy has a potential growth rate of 2% a year. 2% a year. That's historically relatively low, but it really does make a difference when the economy's starting point is 20 trillion, right? Because 2% of 20 trillion is $400 billion in additional economic capacity, activity every year. So our question was basically, where does that come from? Now, traditional economic models will tell you that there is essentially two components, and this was mentioned by Jeffrey earlier as well, of future growth. There is the size of the labor force, which is kind of a quantitative component to it, and then there is labor productivity, which is basically the qualitative element to it. How smart are people in what they do? So what we do is focusing initially on the quantitative element, the labor force growth. We use basically the same data as Jeffrey does. And we reach largely the same conclusions. We have a slightly longer path. We end our data in 2048, so the numbers are a little bigger. But the big picture is the same. And that is that about 80 to 85% of future net job creation in the United States comes from the Latino cohort. In raw numbers, that means that as the total projected employment, the number of jobs in the US in the next 30-odd years will grow by about 18 million. 15 million of those new net jobs will be from the Latino cohort. That is a very large number. And it is, in fact, I think, worth recalling that while the Latino community is obviously not the first community to come to the United States as immigrants, even though that's not the main contributor anymore, there has been prior waves, the Irish, the Germans, etc. But I would argue that certainly it is the case that over such a prolonged period of time, because the Latino community's, if you like, demographic dividend, and that is a sort of economic term that basically means that you have either a national population or a community who has a larger percentage of its worker or its people in the working age population, or basically productively employed. That comes at a time when the rest of the US population slows down. Population growth slows down, the non-Latino component. So there is no other ethnic community in the United States that has ever come to the United States and accounted for 80% or so of net new job creation for several decades. This is unprecedented, you know. And this is a function of the fact that when earlier migration waves came, you know, in the late 19th century, et cetera, they came when the native population was also growing very rapidly. That is not the case anymore. So this is really a one-off in American history. That is the first component. The second component is educational attainment. And has been mentioned by several speakers already today and even yesterday, last night. You know, it is a fact that historically educational attainment by the Latino community lagged the US average. That's a fact. But what is also a fact, and we document this in our report, that, as was also just mentioned by Sol, the basic components of improved educational attainment are now in place for the Latino community. High school graduation rates for the Latino community has risen by 50%, from 60, a graduation rate roughly of 60 to one at about 90 today, which is roughly the US average. If you look at the share of certificates, associate degrees, Latinos now the Latino cohort now accounts for a disproportionately large share of those degrees granted in the United States. So a lot of catch-up or convergence, as we like to say in economics, is happening. It is not the case yet that Latinos graduate at the same ratio at colleges and at college level and higher, so there is still a lot of work to be done. But it is the basics are certainly there, and I would really recommend the article that Armando, the front page of the New York Times today, which basically makes the link between increased educational attainment and lower fertility, which is a relationship that is very, very strong across economic history. We have seen it in many, many countries, and we're now seeing it play out also among the Hispanic community here, which basically is that as the parents get better, or as women get better educated, they tend to have fewer children. This is exactly what is happening in the United States. Then the third component of the study is essentially about entrepreneurship. And Jeffrey spent a lot of time on it. We find essentially the same results, you know, which is because we use the same data from the Kaufman Foundation, namely that Latinos are disproportionately likely to start their own businesses. And again, I think it's important to put this in context, because the overall dynamism of the US economy has been declining over the last 30, 40 years. And by dynamism, I mean if you look at the share of businesses that are started every year, you will see that that percentage has gone down since the late 1970s. And this is, I mean, it's not really clear why that is, but certainly overall aging of the population has a lot to do with that. So again, from the perspective of the contribution of the Latino community, that you have a community that is disproportionately entrepreneurial coming in to the workforce right at the time when the rest of the population, so to speak, gets less entrepreneurial, is exactly the tonic that the US economy needs going forward. And again, I would say that if you put it in a historical context, again, the entrepreneurial, it is certainly the case, as Jeffrey mentioned, that historically, you know, foreign-born population migrants are more entrepreneurial than the native born. This is also the case in the Latino community, but it is not the case as it was that when foreign-born earlier waves of migrants came to the United States, they were facing a native population that were younger and likely more entrepreneurial. But again, this is not the case today for Latinos, so the relative contribution of the Latino community at this point in time and in the next couple of decades is going to be disproportionately large. And I think I'll stop there.
Excellent.